Welcome back to Curious Christianity. I have a special guest with me, Travis Campbell. We actually got to meet at an apologetics conference. We ended up having a very spirited discussion over dinner to such a degree that I thought it would be a great thing to bring him here to share a lot of his knowledge and wisdom on some very, very deep topics. If you're at all interested in the deeper subjects of the faith, if you're familiar with divine simplicity or Molinism or Thomism or Calvinism, then you're going to want to tune in for this one because I think it'll be a very interesting discussion. Travis, welcome to the channel.
Well, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do, kind of some of your areas of expertise?
I went off to seminary, to Dallas Theological Seminary, to get my master's degree. And while I was there, I became reformed.
And when you say reformed, you don't mean saved.
Right. Yeah. I just simply mean I adopted the Reformed tradition as the most plausible model for understanding Christianity. And to gain more knowledge there, I went to Westminster for that reason, but also had become very intrigued with the apologetical method of Cornelius Van Til, and I wanted to master that methodology. And so I got my PhD in apologetics or philosophical theology in 2004. And since then, I've been a history teacher, and I teach comparative religion at a local high school in my hometown of Albany, Georgia. And a few years ago, I started an organization called Consider This, which is a small apologetics organization that's just dedicated to defending the truth claims of Christianity.
So yeah, I think that apologetics seems like it's been a big part of your life. Did you actually, I don't know, were you trained in it as a young person, or was that kind of something that happened later in life?
I grew up in the church, so I don't have a cool testimony where I was a drug addict and found Jesus or anything like that. I had a father who raised me to be a Christian, put the fear of God in me, as they used to say back in the day.
Nobody knows what that means today.
Right. But, I grew up in the Methodist church.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I
That
did.
sounds interesting because I'm afraid not as many people grow up in the Methodist church. And then even further than that, you've actually become reformed now.
I've had a journey in that sense. But when I was almost 15, the summer after my 8th grade year, my sister, her then boyfriend, now husband, received Christ as his Savior, and he was witnessed to by Pentecostals.
You're not going to support the Holy Rollers?
Well, I mean, so the first taste of Christianity that I had, what I would call evangelical, or what we would call born again Christianity, that was a Pentecostal version of that. So my sister came to Christ within a month of that, and then I was her first project, and she began witnessing to me, and I resisted at first.
Mm-hmm.
Then I heard a sermon by Charles Stanley on
Mm-hmm.
why Jesus came, and that very night. I talked to her and her then boyfriend on the phone, and I trusted Christ as my Savior. Afterwards I did a lot of the things that teenagers do. I lived very inconsistently with my profession.
Mm-hmm.
But then one of my middle school football coach, he and I became friends when he started leading FCA meetings. And I used to go and listen to him. And I just became extremely interested in the Bible. And I got to where I just couldn't get enough of it. So I would spend hours and hours, especially after I graduated from high school and went to college. And I began just really thinking about theology. And I figured this is the only thing I really wanted to do. But as I was in college, I was constantly told from high school, when I was taking Bible courses at the boarding school that I went to, and even in college, constantly told that the Bible can't be trusted. So I got a heavy dose of what you would call liberal theology at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I guess today it's called progressive Christianity. And so it was sitting in the class, listening to objections to Christianity, going to the library, looking up answers. And I did the kind of thing that you were describing early on. I was like, oh my gosh, I got to have all these answers. I got involved in Campus Crusade for Christ, and it was there that I got turned on to Josh McDowell,
Mm-hmm.
And then later William Lane Craig. And when I read the oldest version of Reasonable Faith. It was that Introduction to Apologetics that I think he wrote in 1982, and then it became Reasonable Faith, the second and then the third as installment of that. And he had this doctrine of the internal witness of the Holy Spirit. And it was one of the most relieving things that I learned.
Yeah. So that,
My junior year in college, but also I was getting just all this ammunition, and that's sort of the short of it. I engaged in my interest in apologetics came right out of just my own need to find answers to the
yep.
things I was hearing from professors and other people.
That was pretty much my story. Like that was, I was in apologetics because I had this internal existential need for the answer. I had to have the answer. And it was actually one of my philosopher friends who liberated me. And he did it rather unwittingly. But of course, I still thought it was ironic that it was like, and I think he's got his PhD in philosophy of science right now. I was talking to him one day, and he was talking about Sunday morning sermon and the Bible and stuff. And he was just talking about how he's like, hey, look, if you are only willing to accept things that you can understand, then you're putting your own mind as the chief authority above everything else, right? Because you're never willing to just say, hey, God, you're the authority. And if you say something and I still don't understand it, that doesn't mean that I'm going to put it beneath my own stuff. I didn't really tell him at the moment, but man, that hit home so hard. I understood what he was saying. And at the time I was reaching the end where I was getting exhausted. I was running on burnout because I was just constantly just had to have the answers and, was in fear, right? Exactly. Fear for my own faith and stuff like that. And that was so liberating. Where you get the chance. Once you grab hold of that, it was exactly as you explained earlier, right? Then you're free. And I do. And that's actually part of the point of this entire channel. I call it Curious Christianity. And the point of it is that once you have God and the Holy Spirit and the testimony of the Holy Spirit solid as your foundation, that you know him and you know how this all works and your relationship is sound, then I can explore the Bible. Because if something in the Bible, somebody disproves one of my beliefs in the Bible, it doesn't rock my world. It doesn't change my entire life, right? So I'm free to explore the Bible, to have liberating and free conversations, and just to enjoy the beauty of it, right? Enjoy the beauty of what the Bible has, because if my fundamentalism is cracked, I don't have to worry about that. If somebody, whatever, disproves one of my arguments, it's okay. That's all right.
If the one of the questions we have to ask is, if the fruit of the Spirit is peace and self-control, why are there so many angry apologists out there?
Man, that's it. That's it, right?
So thank God for just the peace he gives us in the midst of all of this. So
yeah. And I almost feel bad because I feel like at some points with your journey being a very serious, deep intellectual of studying the scripture, that must have been lonely. Like intellectuals sometimes are kind of in isolation because you know what? Usually there's only like one per church, maybe two.
I've never really thought about that. I haven't really thought about it. There have been lonely times. I don't think it had anything to do with my intellectualism. I didn't really become if I am an intellectual, it's only because I'm a Christian, because I was the weird, I was the guy that was always getting in trouble. I was the class clown. I didn't read. I didn't do anything. And even after I became a Christian, for a few years, I was not a hard worker. At the end of my sophomore year, I had a 1.8 GPA. My guidance counselor said, "You're not getting into college." So I had to make desperate measures to start doing that. So it wasn't until, I came across kids my age at boarding school that actually liked to read and explore. And I read my first book, which was the greatest biography ever. The title is Catch a Fire: The Life of Bob Marley by Timothy White. And because Bob Marley is one of my all-time favorite musicians. So I started just becoming curious about the world around me. For a few years later, I was reading the Bible all the way through and just soaking that in. I had been reading the Bible for years, but not just like all the way through. And so, it was a slow, long journey, but most of my roommates in college were non-believers. I only had one Christian friend who was a roommate of mine in college. The rest were non-Christians, and they were always challenging me. Loved them, but I never felt lonely.
That's good.
I the church that I currently go to, lots of, the Reformed wing of Christianity has a lot of people that are very serious about their theology. And so you better be on your toes, and, we'll scrap with each other as much as we scrap with others on the mat, the theological mat, if you will.
Yep.
So I guess I've just never felt that, at least for those reasons.
That's good. That's good. I know for some people it certainly can be. It can be a struggle. There's just those one or two guys, and you're the guy that wants to ask him is like, hey, what about this? And everyone's like, no,
Yeah.
let's pass on by, because they don't want to answer.
Theology is a strange subject in the sense that once you get a degree in it, you become like, people look at you askance. They don't really want to ask you questions because, I don't know, they don't want you to like rock their world or something. Like if you get a PhD in science, you're the go-to guy. If you're a doctor, a medical doctor, people are always coming to you. But if you're a theologian, no one really wants to talk to you about your wheelhouse, So it's just a very weird kind of thing to be in. So,
well, don't worry, Travis. We're going to be great friends. I'm the opposite. I'm usually hammering at all of the theologians. I want to know, hey, what's your degree? Let's talk about that. I can be notorious for asking questions, though. Wow. I'm a big fan of questions. But see, you know what, though? You're the person that likes them as well. So we're in good company.
I have answers to all your questions. I just don't know if they're true.
Yeah. Well, it's just like one of my pastors once said, is like, hey, don't worry, I got the answer. What are we talking about? Yeah. So now, let's talk about a couple other things here, right? So you are a Thomist, is that right?
I prefer Reformed Thomists because I am.
Oh my gosh,
yeah.
Well, okay, yeah.
Some people would say it's an oxymoron to be a Reformed Thomist, but I like the label.
So can you help explain for some other people, the audience, because I'm sure everyone knows, most people don't. Most people have no idea. They at this point, honestly, they all think that you carry around a giant book and cast spells. But what is Thomism anyway?
Thomism is obviously the philosophy or the philosophical theology that was first spawned by the mind of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was a 13th century Dominican monk.
And that's why it's called Thomism, right? It's because of Thomas, right?
Thomas Aquinas, yes. Yeah. And a lot of people say, well, why isn't it called Aquinianism? And which is a great question. Why do we call it Thomism? Well, Aquino is really the place where he's from. It's the county that his family resided in. And Thomas just as his name. So he was brother Thomas. And so obviously the philosophy that we're going to call it is Thomism, not Aquinianism. And
you should call the other one Hippoism.
There you go. Yeah. I mean, that's a great analogy. So we name it after the philosopher himself, not where he's from. If you can summarize Thomas's theology, his philosophical theology, in a very simple statement, and you'll find this in almost every Thomist you'll read. They'll at some point say something like this in a nutshell, that what Thomas Aquinas was trying to do is he was trying to put the truths of St. Augustine in the terms of Aristotle. So he was taking an Augustinian theology where, we're saved by grace alone, for example, or a strong view of the sacraments of the church. This is where my Reformed proclivities would sort of shy away from him, but he's going to have a strong Augustinian view of the sacraments, a strong view of grace, anti-Pelagian, upholding original sin and that sort of thing. But he's going to put all of that in the terms of Aristotle. So he's not a warmed over Aristotelian. He is an Augustinian first, and he's using Aristotle's insights to defend what he thinks is the best expression of the Catholic faith.
Yeah, and you just mean the universal church faith.
Yeah. So at the time,
I know he is Catholic, but
at the time, there's only really two wings of Christianity. Basically, is the Greek wing. You do have Coptic Christianity, but you basically have the Greek wing of Christianity, Greek Orthodoxy, and then you have, of course, Catholicism, which is in a lot of ways subservient to the Pope. And remember that he's living just a few years after the papacy of Innocent III, that's where the church was brought to its most powerful expression. The Fourth Lateran Council had just formed in 1215. So about 10 years before Aquinas was born, the sacramentalism, transubstantiationism, if you will, all of those were codified in the decades before he was born, especially in the Fourth Lateran Council. So he's trying to give a defense of what the church is already teaching. And he uses all of his genius to synthesize everything he knows about the church and about church history, about doctrine and everything into a coherent system.
Yeah, he has written a ridiculous amount. They actually have a complete works of his stuff. It's something like 1,000 pages, and it's tiny print, and the book is it's ridiculously huge. So
he wrote multi-volume works, and the Blackfriars edition of the Summa Theologica, which is his systematic theology, his summary of all of theological doctrine. The Blackfriars edition, I believe, is about 65 volumes.
Yeah.
Now that's a diglot, so you're getting the Latin and the English, but that's huge. And then his Summa Contra Gentiles, your standard English version of that is going to be about 5 volumes. His work on truth is about 7 volumes. So you put all of that together, he wrote about 200 books.
Yeah.
And he died at the age of 50.
Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. And to imagine that he did that by hand is ridiculous. I have a hard enough time typing out pages on my computer.
Well, there is a story that the way he would dictate his books to he had secretaries, and the story goes, you can accept it or reject it, that he had 5 secretaries lined up. And then what he did is say he's working on his commentary on Aristotle, he's working on a commentary on the Bible, a section of a Summa and so forth. He'd give a line to one, and as that guy's writing, he's given a line to another. And so he's writing 4 books at the same time. Now that's probably hyperbole and apocryphal, but at least is an illustration of just how prodigious he was and how quickly he was able to put stuff out. He wrote tons and tons of material within just a few short years, really.
So and now I am curious what you're going to say. So I've had Eli Ayala on my channel, and I asked him this, and he was kind of a little bit more on the fence, but can you be a Thomist, but not a Calvinist?
I don't think you could be a consistent one, because Thomas, his soteriology probably it resembles what we often call 4-point Calvinism. So you at least need to hold to, on the tulip, if that's your standard of what constitutes Calvinism, the L there, the limited atonement doctrine, would be something that Thomas wouldn't be comfortable with. But all of the other points he's going to hold to. There are important differences when it comes to human nature. His view of original sin is just not what the Reformed theologians will say about what happens to human nature at the fall. For Thomas, original sin just is the loss of original justice. Adam is created into this world, and God gives him what we call a superadded grace. In Latin, it's donum superadditum. So this superadded grace, this superadded gift of grace, is given to Adam some point after his creation or concurrently with it. And so that donum superadditum is not natural to who Adam is. And so when he falls, that gift of grace, he falls from grace, right? That gift of grace is removed from him, and he's back to his original state. What the Reformed want to say, and I agree with the Reformed on this is what makes me a Reformed Thomist, is that I want to say that original sin just is the corruption of human nature itself. And whatever gifts that we were given before the fall, they were not redemptive in character. They were gracious in that sense, but they were not redemptive. Because man did not need redeeming. And so, as my friend Lane Tipton likes to say, and Lane is a non-Thomist, strong Van Tillian, Reformed theologian, but and I'll even go ahead and give this plug for Lane. I think he's the greatest living expositor of Van Til's theology. Lane would say that before the fall, the Reformed have a far more elevated view of human nature than the Roman Catholics do, because we don't have a donum superaddum. And then after the fall, we have a far lower view of human nature than
Mhm.
the Catholics in general, or the Thomists in particular, do, because we're talking about the actual corruption of human nature, which makes God's grace so much more than necessary.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's
But,
interesting.
but that said, Thomas is going to have strong prevenient grace doctrines in his soteriology, and he's definitely going to hold to a doctrine of unconditional election, that God's election of those for salvation is not based on anything that they are going to do, but rather wholly according to his sovereign mercy. And you'll see that in his commentary on Romans 9, his commentary on Ephesians 1, and various sections in the Summa Theologica.
So yeah, that is pretty much what Eli has also said, and most of those guys have all said is that yeah, like if you're going to be a presuppositionalist, you have to be a Calvinist. If you're pretty much all those things, like Calvinism's kind of just entailed in a lot of these
Mhm.
other doctrines and stuff that they hold. So, and that is how Travis and I got to meet each other. We were at dinner during the apologetics conference. Well, after the apologetics conference, sort of. So I am a Molinist. In other words, I don't hold to Calvinism and I don't hold to some of the same beliefs or presuppositions as Travis does. So Molinism is the idea or belief that is largely predicated on one aspect of God's knowledge. And there are kind of a lot of things that go into this, but to basically flesh it out. So usually everybody affirms that God has like natural knowledge. He has like knowledge of the free world. He knows what time it is, what day it is. I mean, however you want to flesh out God's natural knowledge. And he has foreknowledge. He knows everything that will happen. So that's, of course, where we get prophecy and lots of other things from. And then the Molinist posits this idea that God also knows what human beings would do given any different circumstances or situations or other things like that. So it'd be the idea that hypothetically, if God created a different world that were different structured than this one, he knows that what Travis would do if he never, I don't know, never ended up going to college. He knows what would happen, in these different circumstances and situations. And so they call it middle knowledge because they find it as a logical moment in between God's natural knowledge and before his foreknowledge of what God does know in the future. Now, of course, the whole point of all this is that, yeah, people disagree about what's possible and how things work. And there are a lot of presuppositions, but that would be one of the differences, is also just stems from human freedom and what people believe about freedom. So that's like a very, very brief, short summary. But would you agree that that's essentially at least part of it?
Yeah, I don't think that you can hold to a doctrine of conditional election and maintain what we would call omniprescience, the idea that God knows the future exhaustively and
Mhm.
exhaustive foreknowledge of the future, or to put it another way, meticulous providence and libertarian freedom. If you're
Yeah.
going to hold to all those views and say that God is he elects on the basis of what he sees you're going to do or what you would do if given grace, to put it in a more Molinistic cast, then yeah, I think that some kind of doctrine of mental knowledge is a prerequisite for that. Just to let you know, I did write a book a few years ago called The Wonderful Decree. In that book, I do spend one chapter expositing just what middle knowledge is. And I take three theologians who say they don't believe in middle knowledge, but they do hold to a view of they hold to a view of conditional election. And I show how there's a doctrine of middle knowledge firmly implicit in what they're saying.
Mhm.
It's like you can't avoid it all, and it's all to illustrate the fact that here are these brilliant theologians. All three of these guys were or are just extremely intelligent, and they know the terrain of theology and all of that. And though they try to avoid it, they couldn't help but embrace it to maintain, to bring all this stuff together: meticulous
Yeah.
providence, libertarian freedom, and a conditional view of election. So
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things, like some people do. We all hold views that I think it's rather ironic how many views people on just an everyday basis hold, that if you actually showed them up next to each other, they don't actually agree with one another. Like all the time, we have our own cognitive dissonance where we've actually separated ourselves. And I can't remember one of the last ones, but I know I've had it happen to me where one of my friends is like, "Hey, you're doing this, but you also believe in this. How do those go together?"
Right.
And just that realization of like, you're right. I have no idea. Why do I do that?
Sure. Well, one of the, we're saved by grace alone. We're not saved by consistency. And let's thank God for that, or else all of us would be damned.
I know, right?
We're saved by grace alone. But I think that part of our sanctification has to be cleaning up both our lives and our thoughts. And sometimes you can't do one without the other, right?
So wait, are you saying though that part of our sanctification is synergistic as opposed to monergistic?
I do think that sanctification has a synergistic aspect to it. Yes.
Okay. But what about our salvation, Travis?
God is working with us. Well, we're justified by grace alone through faith alone, and we're sanctified by grace and faith and works.
But am I saved monergistically? In other words, is God just save me, or do I play a role? Is it also synergistic? Do I play a role in my own salvation?
Well, I see salvation as having three components to it:
Okay.
justification, sanctification, and glorification. And without justification, my sanctification is all for naught, because
Yes.
I can't be saved by the law, but I am justified by through my faith alone.
But hey,
And I
man, look,
cannot.
people are still trying. They're still trying.
Yeah, but I don't believe that I could place my faith in Christ to be justified apart from God's monergistically working upon me and in me and through me to embrace the gospel. So I do believe that regeneration has to precede faith, or efficacious grace would be another way to put it, must be
Mhm.
part and parcel of my coming to faith, or else I wouldn't be able to come to faith. Now that
Well,
I'm justified, and now that I am quote unquote saved, and now that the Holy Spirit takes up residence in me, there is, God is at work in me to will according to his good pleasure. And so God is working in and through me, but he doesn't do it wholly apart from me.
mhm.
I'm freely having this conversation with you. I'm growing in the grace and knowledge of Jesus, and sanctification is progressive, and sometimes we can regress and become less sanctified. I'm hopefully more sanctified today than I was when I was first saved, but I will never be more justified today or in the future or in the past than I was when I was first saved. Justification is an absolute, and I cannot attain that other than monergistically.
So this is let's see here. There's so many good roads to go here. So I would say that the rub to me is usually that there are a bunch of presuppositions that we always just kind of clash on, right?
Sure.
I'm sure that you have actually. I am curious. I want to ask this. Have you argued with many Molinists in person? I know. I read your section. So he does. He's written a great section on Molinism, and so obviously I know you've done it in academia. But I was just wondering about everyday conversation.
No, opportunity has not presented itself for me to engage in a lot of one-on-one conversations. I've
Because
had a few.
all your
And
friends are Thomists, right?
I'm kind of a weird cat, because I can kind of feel my Reformed friends cringing at some of the things that I'm saying, because of my devotion to Aquinas. So that's part of the weird thing about, I don't know really where I fit a lot of times. So you asked me before if I feel lonely. Whatever my intellectualism has brought me, I don't think it's brought me loneliness, but my weirdness has brought me all kinds.
Don't
Um,
worry, I can relate with you on that.
so I mean, my, if you want the best comparison, kind of the theologian that a lot of people might know of, where my views are most close to, at least in these areas of apologetics and metaphysics and so forth, it might be R.C. Sproul. And
Really?
at the end of Chosen by God, you'll see that he says that we're, sanctification is synergistic.
Yeah,
But
I'm a big fan of R.C. Sproul too.
yeah,
So
and so I mean, he didn't use the label Reformed Thomist very often. But he was a huge fan of Thomas Aquinas, and
He was a Thomist, I do believe.
yeah,
So,
there's no doubt about it. The text Classical Apologetics.
mhm.
When I went to Westminster and imbibed Van Til for a long time, I was a very strong proponent of Van Til for about 6 months or so, but I just started seeing cracks in the wall. But while I was there, I just used to kind of make fun of the book Classical Apologetics. But I've actually come full circle and seen it to be far more worthy of our consideration than I believed it had or was or what have you when I was at Westminster. So, I've just made a lot of changes. I've seen when you're a young theology student and there are a lot of people ganging up on a theologian at a certain school. And I'm not saying that people are uncharitable. I'm not saying that, but in the best sense of the term, in an ironic way, if you will, Sproul could often be the whipping boy in Van Tilian circles.
That would make sense. Well, is the reason because of his opposition to presuppositional apologetics
Oh
comparatively
yeah,
to Van Til?
sure. And the line that I often got and that I often still get from Van Tilians is Sproul's great when it comes to theology. He's one of the greatest communicators of the modern era. And I think everybody would agree with that. I mean, there was no better
Yeah.
communicator. There may have been communicators as good, but none better than R.C. Sproul. And when he's doing expositions on Reformed theology, it's just golden. But then he gets into apologetics, and then Reformed people just shake their heads in derision and like, I don't understand how this guy's doing this. But I think Dr. Sproul has been vindicated over the last couple of years, especially with the release of Fesco's work on reforming apologetics, where he shows the historical continuities between the reformers and the classical method. Richard Muller's 4-volume work on theological prolegomena. The first 2 are on prolegomena, and the next 2 are on doctrine of God and the Trinity. And James Dolezal has written a book defending classical theism. So those 3 works of varying lengths, and Dolezal wrote a great dissertation on simplicity. And
Yeah, I've read 2 of his books on divine simplicity. I actually gotten to talk with him a little bit as well. He, oddly enough, he was a childhood friend of my best friend, and so it was kind of cool. And of course, they have the families and everything. They're kind of just like, oh, it's kind of cool that James Dozell is, kind of a big name in reform circles, and after all of his work. So
yeah, and I think that All That Is in God is one of the most important books written in recent memory. I mean, it's just a readable length. And then for whatever it's worth, I mean, I've tried to build on some of that. At the Apologetics Conference, the paper that I presented just was an attempt to show the continuities between Aquinas and the Protestant reformers when it came to at least 2 issues, one being the doctrine of God, and second of all being their defense of God's existence via the contingency argument. I think that there's a lot there. And so I think Sproul, near the end of his life, was so very happy to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and that his being sort of beat up on by, in a good way, but beat up on by presuppositionalists. To wit, you're not being consistent with your Reformed confession if you follow a classical method of apologetics. I think that he's been vindicated in a lot of ways.
Well, it was Dr. Richard Howe who kept me away from presuppositional apologetics. So I had saw that it was one of my first major kind of seeing of the clash, but it was his debate with Jason Lyle and Dr.
Scott
Oliphant.
Oliphant.
Dr. Oliphant. Yeah. Yeah, Scott Oliphant.
I was there. I was there at that debate. Yeah. So
yeah, I think I've watched that video probably twice, But yeah.
What's really interesting about that is that, like, take someone like Scott Oliphant, he will say that you're not consistently reformed unless you're a Van Tilian. But then if you look at what Scott has been doing with the doctrine of God, is raised a lot of eyebrows. I mean, one of his books, he actually says in so many words that when God created the universe, he took on contingent properties.
And that's super contrary to divine simplicity. And
that is. And so he takes on these covenantal properties, as he calls them, so much so that when he descends and walks in the garden and says, Adam, where are you? That wasn't a rhetorical question. He didn't know
Really?
what it was. Yeah.
Scott Oliphant says that?
But Scott Oliphant says that. I can give the name of the book in the description below. I'll send it to you, and I'll give you the page number.
Okay.
That's not even something that any neoclassical theist would want to say. That's closer to what panentheists want to say about God. So it's a very disconcerting thing to read from someone who calls himself reformed.
So yeah, so you would, of course, I'll just say for the sake of clarity for everyone else, believe in divine simplicity, because I read that in your paper. Now, I'll just say for the record, I don't, at least on some of it. I'm not saying that God has a body or something like that, but the strong forms of simplicity, I don't find very compelling. I think it's a very interesting subject, and it's been an interesting subject to me because, of course, it does come up in lots of theology books. It does come up in lots of textbooks. For instance, I saw you quoted Stephen Charnock throughout your paper and stuff. I love Stephen Charnock. Stephen Charnock is influenced, right, by these types of doctrines. Lots of our doctrines of immutability, impassibility, and all these other doctrines that nobody else has any idea of what I'm saying. I think that, some of them are certainly important, but I would tend to agree with Craig that some of them are potentially less important, or I find them to be, well, my concern is I find them to be contradictory to other doctrines of God that we hold. And of course, that would be my primary concern. I haven't been compelled by James Dolezal's books in being convinced by entirely of his argument. I know that there are many classical theists that find this to be a very essential doctrine. Now, it hasn't been a dogma of the Catholic Church, but it has been a big doctrine that a lot of people have certainly embraced. Would you say that just kind of, divine simplicity, Calvinism, Thomism, that they just kind of all go together? They're just kind of like they kind of seem very linked to me in many ways. Like I very much can understand the logical connections that one might make.
I'm not going to be so dogmatic as to say that logically speaking, one must be a Thomist metaphysically to be a Reformed theologian. So I can totally, I don't know, I'm not confident that if I sat down with someone like John Calvin and said, are you a hylomorphist? I don't know if Calvin would say yes to that. And for the audience,
I don't know that one. All right, teach me this one. Hylomorphist?
Yeah, for the audience, and for you, hylomorphism is just the view that there is a distinction between the form and the matter of something in all contingent things, or at least all natural things. So every natural thing we see has within it a distinction between its form and its matter. The form, its essence, and the matter would be the physical stuff of which it's made.
Okay. Yep.
My dear friend Richard Howe has given illustrations of this, and I've come up with my own to sort of but it's inspired by some of the things he said. I look out of my window and there's a dogwood about 10 feet from my window. It's just this beautiful tree. And I see a bird in the tree. Well, what is it that distinguishes the bird and the tree? We don't want to say it's the physical stuff, because that's actually what they have in common. It's the arrangement of that physical stuff that distinguishes them. Okay. Well, the arrangement of that physical stuff just is the form of the bird vis-a-vis the tree. So what distinguishes things in the natural world would be form, which actually is what they have in common, at least naturally just observing them, would be the physicality. And so hylomorphism is kind of concomitant with Thomism. You're not going to be a Thomist unless you see a form matter distinction, or form matter schema, if you will, in the various things that I observe. And it's from that observation that we begin to build up an argument from the contingency of the things in the world that we see to the fact that there is an uncaused cause sustaining them. Mm-hmm. And then, kind of like Craig with the Kalam argument, a Thomistic arguer is then going to infer certain attributes of this uncaused cause, to wit, the uncaused cause just is the God of classical theism, which would include everything from his personality to his omnipotence to his simplicity.
Do you want to try and take a crack at explaining what divine? We've been talking about divine simplicity, but the average person does not understand what that means at all. Like I'm sure, like if you're in the literature and you've ever mentioned it at lunch somewhere, The average person doesn't, they're just like, well, what do you mean God is simple? No, God's not simple. He's the most complex being in the world. He's all powerful, all knowing, fill in the
Mm,
blank. So, what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about divine simplicity?
sure. Obviously, we're not saying that God is simplistic or that God is easy to understand. So when we say that God is simple, we're talking about what God is metaphysically. And, if you look at me, I'm a complex being. I'm made up of multiple parts. I have two arms, two legs. I have a nose. I have eyes. And that composition of all the things that I am, that's what makes me me. So some people want to say, well, just as I am a composition of all of my attributes and all of my parts, so God would be just the composition of all of his attributes. So some models of God and his relationship to his attributes would be kind of like a cushion, pin cushion, and all the pins on it. And so each pin would represent an attribute of God. So you have the being of God, that would be like the pin cushion, and all
Mhm.
the pins would be his attributes, his omnipotence, his eternity, his knowledge, so on and so forth. Now, if that is true, then just like me, God has his knowledge. I have knowledge, God has knowledge. I have two arms, God has two arms. But if you think about it, the very fact that I have knowledge is proof that I can lose it. I have knowledge that I have lost. I have money, I can lose them. I have clothes on, I can lose them. I have two arms and I can lose those arms. Everything that I have, I can lose.
Mhm.
So if God has his knowledge, that would kind of imply that God could lose that knowledge.
Why do you say that? Why does it imply that he could lose it if he has it?
Well, if the model is the pin cushion and you
Mhm.
have the pins, I can take the pin out of the pin cushion. And so,
Mhm.
by way of analogy, you could, in principle, conceive of God, and or God could lose what he has under some set of circumstances.
But if it was the case that God did not have the knowledge, he would cease to be God, right? Or it wouldn't be referring to the same
Right.
person.
So on the composite model of God's attributes, God is in a sense a contingent being.
Well, you're positing that he's a contingent being, right? Because he's composed of these parts. So you would say that these parts are not therefore essential, right? So in other words, if
Right.
because it could be that it's like, well, he has a part, so therefore that means he could lose that part because
Mhm.
it's not necessarily the exact identifiable essence of God himself, right?
Yeah. So if God's essence is composed of parts, those parts that compose him could be lost as a matter of principle.
Mhm.
Even if in fact that never happens, it could happen. And that's what makes God, at least in the manifestation that we see now, something less than necessary. Here we can stretch this a little bit further. Is there anything about me that is essential? The Thomist would say yes. For example, there's an essential attribute that I possess called rational animality. Okay, so I'm a rational animal.
Mhm.
So if you were to take rational animality from me, I would no longer exist. I would no longer be me. So you may obstruct my rationality. So, for example, you could give me a head injury and my capacity to think is obstructed. But as long as I exist as a human. And as long as I am a human, I possess the essential property of rational animality. It can be obstructed, it can be obscured. But once it dissolves, I dissolve. Same thing with my volitionality. I have free will as a human being. And yes, I'm reformed and I'm saying that I have free will. So, so volitional animality would be another essential component of who I am as a human. Take you can curb it, you can throw me in jail, and that limits my capacity to express my volition. But if you remove it from me, metaphysically speaking, I am no longer me. So it's not to say that a contingent thing can't have essential properties. The substance that is me has part of its essence, rational and volitional animality. Well, you could conceive of God as having something similar, like the substance that is God has certain essential attributes, which if they were to dissolve, God would no longer be God. But that's the question, isn't it? Since he is composed of those parts, just like I am composed of rational animality, volitional animality, plus all of my accidental properties, like I'm sitting here talking to you and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So also God would be composed of essential properties, whatever those would be, say his knowledge and power. But could he lose them? And the Thomist wants to say that if he is composed of them, then by definition, he could lose them.
So divine simplicity is much more, though, than God not having physical parts. Like a pincushion has physical parts, and we understand that because we can see the different pins sticking in it or sticking out of it, right? However, but in this case, what we're actually saying, or what divine simplicity is saying, not that I want to reject every aspect of any arguments made this way, but in divine simplicity, the hardcore version asserts that therefore God simply is his existence, right? So in other words, God is, when we say simplicity, what we really mean is he is just one God, and that there isn't really another way or another way to reference or speak about him, because all of our attempts to actually speak of him are merely analogical. They're kind of talking around the fact, but they can't actually speak truly of God, because there is no actual true analogy of God, right? Because nothing else is like him.
Well, I wouldn't want to say that my propositions about God are not true. So what I would want to, the way I would want to put it would be, and let me go ahead and give you one of the historical objections to simplicity to kind of illustrate the point.
Okay.
So yeah, it's true. The pincushion analogy is a physical object, is using a physical object to describe and or articulate something, say things about something, God, that is wholly non-physical. So all analogies limp. That's true. And one of the problems with simplicity people have often brought up is that if God just is his essence, and if there are no real distinctions within God, then couldn't we turn around and say that God forgives by his justice and judges by his mercy, or condemns through his mercy?
Yeah, because
That
because
would
in
be,
this, yep.
yeah, because the attributes would be so commingled that there would be no distinctions between them. And therefore, it is just as meaningful to say that he forgives by his mercy and condemns by his justice as it is to say that he condemns by his mercy and forgives by his justice. So,
Because there's no distinction inside of God.
right. And so it entails a kind of absolute agnosticism whereby I can't know God. And Thomas does make the curious claim that we cannot know what God is. There you have it. And
There you go.
since
Thank you for
Jesus
refuting it. All
has
right, we're done. I'm gonna go. No,
right,
I'm just kidding.
and to press the point against my own view, an opponent of simplicity would say, Jesus himself says that this is eternal life, that they may know you, the one true God, and Jesus whom he has sent. So you can affirm simplicity.
There you go, roasted.
And so there we go. It's all done. It's a done deal. And what the classical tradition has said, and I think that this is fair, I don't think this is skirting anything, is to say that while in God there are no real distinctions, there are mental distinctions that the creature can make, such that when we say that God forgives by his mercy and condemns through his justice, we are saying something true of God. So it's a virtual distinction and not a real distinction that we're affirming. So therefore, agnosticism is avoided while simplicity is preserved. Now you might say, well, why do you want to preserve this doctrine? Well, it goes back to the claim that whatever admits of composition has to have a cause, and or whatever admits of composition is contingent.
Right, right, right. And we, of course, want to assert that God is divinely ase, that he is a
Sure.
necessary being, that he is not contingent or derives from something else other than himself, but
That's right.
rather exists necessarily and is the answer himself as to why he exists and those sorts of notions.
So the question would always be, how can you affirm on the one hand that God is composite, that he just is the full composition of all his attributes, and at the same time affirm that God is necessary? That is the challenge that the classical theist is going to give to
Yeah.
any proponent of neoclassical theism or some other version of theism.
So that everyone understands, divine simplicity is saying more than God just doesn't have a physical body, but it's saying that God does not have any distinctions in himself at all, metaphysical or other. So in other words, to say that God has wisdom and justice, they just are God. Would that be accurate, right?
Yeah, God just,
He
well,
just is.
to quote Dolitz All, who gets it from Augustine, all that is in God is God.
That's right. All that is in God is God. Right.
So God
So
doesn't have knowledge, he is knowledge. God doesn't
right.
have justice, he is justice. God doesn't have wisdom, he is wisdom, and so on and so forth. God
So
is his power.
right, right, right. So here's my objection. And I
Okay.
know people have answers to this, but this is my objection. I do not think that you can hold to the Trinity and hold divine simplicity. I
Okay.
think that these are contradictory. I don't find any compelling arguments on simplicity. So do you have any thoughts on that? Because that's probably my biggest argument. I mean, that is
Well,
one.
no, it's a very good, it's probably one of the most common objections that people will give to simplicity. How can you have a triune God, yet God be absolutely one in his essence? So I guess my question to you
Yeah.
is, what is your argument
Yep.
from God is Trinity, therefore God is not simple?
You know, Travis, that's why you're here, man, because you actually ask questions too. I appreciate that. No, so this would be the argument. There are three persons of the Trinity. Persons are metaphysically distinct. Therefore, God is not divinely simple.
Okay, all Thomists and all Reformed theologians, for that matter, are going to say that within God there is a real distinction between the persons of the Godhead.
I know, but this is the part where I just go like, okay, yeah, but this is where I find him just to be have cognitive dissonance. It's like I don't think that you can actually affirm that, like, and
Mhm.
still affirm divine simplicity because it's like, yeah, they want to say it's like I've talked with actually a few different Thomists online, and they kind of say this, and I'm just like, but they there's an analogy they use where they say it's all a part of the same line. However, there are distinctions inside of the line and they kind of have some word salad as to make out these distinctions. And I'm just like, well, I just feel like this violates the law of identity, right? So, in other words, like if the Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, you know, so on and so forth, you know, kind of a traditional
Mhm.
Trinitarian type of thing. Therefore, they are distinct, right? So, in other words, you cannot say that it violates of identity to say that it's like, no, they are identical and not identical. If everything that can be said of A can be said of B, A and B are the same thing. If something can be said of A that cannot be said of B, A and B are not the same thing.
Mhm.
So I just feel like that violates the law of identity.
Okay, well, yeah, I guess I would just say that it is true that there's no essential distinction between the Father and the Son and the Spirit, but there is a relational distinction.
So that's what they say, right? They say there's a relational
And
distinction.
if I may be so bold as to, I'm not familiar with the analogy you gave, but I'll give a common analogy given by Thomist.
Okay. Yep. Go for it.
And I'll first let me quote the Council of Florence. And the Council of Florence is really important. It's a 15th century council where it was ecumenical in the sense that Greek Orthodox theologians who tend towards a more social Trinitarianism showed up at the council and they hammered these things out. And at the council itself, the theologians there said, in God, all is absolutely one and the same, except where there is relative opposition. And the analogy would be that the exact same surface, there's no, in a triangle, there's no distinction whatsoever between the angles of the triangle and the surface of the triangle. The exact same surface that subsists in one angle subsists in all of them. However, because there is a relative opposition between the angles, there is a distinction between the angles and one another. And it's interesting that the triangle continues to serve, as Garrigou-Lagrange says, this great analogy for the Trinity, because there is relative opposition between the angles in a triangle, but there's no opposition in the surface. And so we have an analogy on how it can be the case that there's relative opposition, but no essential distinction between Father, Son, and Spirit. So that the exact same essence that subsists in the Father subsists also in the Son and the Spirit.
See, I feel like...
I'll just say one more thing
go ahead.
About that. I am want to say that when I say that the Father is God, that's an identity statement. The Father is God. And as you probably know, that there are certain social Trinitarians that we can name that aren't comfortable with that language, because you pretty much have to say that you can't say that the Father is God until you link him with the Son and the Spirit, so that those composed together make up God. And I do have very serious problems with that, because the biblical language just is that the Father is God, that the Son is God, and the Spirit is God.
Yeah,
we have multiple biblical examples of this.
Exactly right. Those are exactly sort of some of the struggles. But going back to your earlier illustration, which is the common one, is the idea that there's a distinction in relations. So that's actually right. Some of the language that Thomas Aquinas uses is that there are distinction in relations. But the reason that I don't find this satisfying is because it's distinction in relations between what? I don't find relations to be a useful word if it's not between other persons. How can you have relations between nothing? Do you understand my question? I mean, like, are the relations...
I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. I mean, the persons just are these three relations.
What are relations?
Well, just to describe the relation between the Father and Son is the relation between a begetter and the begotten.
I would contend that I think that this is contrary to the Athanasian Creed. I just don't think that you can affirm the two. Now, I know that people do, but the Athanasian Creed states, right, we worship the Father, the person, the Father, right? It makes distinctions in persons, in saying that the Father is a person, the Son is a person, and the Holy Spirit is a person. So there are three persons. And so, of course, I think that it makes sense. You can say that there are three persons that have relations with one another. But if you say that the Father is a relation and the Son is a relation, I feel like this collapses into modalism, to be blunt. I mean, because it's simply a matter of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. They're relations, but they're not persons. And so, and it depends, I guess, it depends if someone wants to fight me on that, if you would make a distinction. But to me, when I talk about you as a person, that is a metaphysically distinct concept or entity.
Well, I guess I'm curious about your appeal to the Athanasian Creed, since if you've read Dolezal, I mean, he points out rightly that all the classical creeds, especially the Nicene and Athanasian creeds, presuppose simplicity. So this is
I know they do. I'm not saying that they don't say that, but I'm saying that they're inconsistent. That's what I'm saying. Because I don't think that the Athanasian Creed is being metaphysically robust enough in its claim that God is a person. And then to explain, because then when we go back to the doctrines of simplicity, they don't, like you mentioned earlier, I don't feel like that they are seriously addressing the issue of personhood itself. So because I think that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are three persons, are, again, I'm just repeating myself, but metaphysically distinct.
So do you see the persons as three, I guess, centers of self-awareness?
I mean, for simplicity's sake. No. For simplicity's sake, yes.
Pardon me, but
Don't worry.
Well, I'm not trying to, I mean, I'm just saying, I don't want to put words in your mouth is all I'm really getting at.
Yeah.
Pardon me. And if you're going to push a kind of univocism between us and God, where God is a person in the same way we are, then what makes me distinct from you as a person would be the fact that I have a self-awareness that is distinct from you. I have a different mind that is distinct from you, and so on and so forth. And so if the persons of the Trinity are three centers of self-consciousness, each with their own set of emotional and volitional properties, then God God becomes a kind of abstract universal that they exemplify more than an absolute essence that subsists in these three persons. You fear that I'm leaning towards modalism. I fear that you're leaning more towards tritheism.
I understand. I understand. And well, like this is, I mean, it's one of the major issues. And actually, so James Dolezal actually said in an interview that simplicity is one of the primary motivating factors for Trinitarian theology at all, period. And I understand that sort of notion. Now, it is my understanding, and I will say that by all means, I'm more than happy to talk about it, but I didn't get a doctoral dissertation in divine simplicity, but
well, neither did I. So
yeah. It seems to me that there are possibilities for what we'll just say like lesser versions of simplicity. And so that's to me all I would say is like I feel like you need a slightly less robust version, and it would be more difficult. And I guess it depends if I don't know, because divine simplicity has such a hard line on metaphysical distinctions, that it doesn't really allow for metaphysical distinctions inside of God. But that's the part where I'm struggling with, is that I don't understand the idea of relations. To me, relations are something that happen in between different things. It's not a subject in and of itself.
I guess I'll try to navigate some of that. One way to, I guess, approach this is just sort of lay out the classical Thomistic doctrine of the Trinity. And I don't want to take too much time in exposition, but just to kind of do it as quickly as I possibly can. You can summarize, we in the Reformed tradition love to count to 5. And so I guess I adopted that for my exposition of the Trinity. You can actually.
Well, don't worry. If they all start with the same letter, you'll be a good pastor.
But 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 simple essence, 2 eternal processions, 3 divine persons, 4 relations, and then 5 common notions. I don't want to spend all my time just doing the full exposition, but I want to concentrate on the processions. So if you have a simple essence,
yes,
and once you start with that presupposition, the question is, how are there distinctions between the persons if the essence is simple? And
that's the question. Yes.
And there's no proof of the Trinity. I'm a Thomist in multiple senses, and one of them would be I don't have an argument for the Trinity in the same way I have an argument for God's existence.
Okay.
The Trinity is something I can only know through revelation.
Yes, revelation. Yep.
Augustine's argument from love is very helpful, and it gives a kind of rationale for why we should believe in a Trinity. But there is something in Neoplatonic or even Parmenidean philosophy, which I think wreaks havoc of philosophy if you keep it in a pantheistic context. To quote Van Til, if we rob the Egyptians of their spoils when we bring this principle over into theism, it actually gives us a rationale for the Trinity. Now, this is a rational principle that I can't prove, but I think it's eminently reasonable. And this is why you can't prove the Trinity. And
let's hear it.
We call it the principle of fecundity. It's just the idea that the good is necessarily diffusive of itself. And by diffusive of itself, we mean it's going to overflow. It's going to go beyond itself. As Jonathan Edwards said, it is no imperfection of a fountain that it would tend to overflow. So a good teacher naturally wants what's in here to go out to his students. A good mother wants to give the resources of her body to her child. A good rich person is not going to be a miser with his money. He's going to give richly. Goodness is naturally diffusive of itself. And if you take that principle and apply it to God, then how can you have God reproduce himself, if you will, without reproducing in a causal sense? And there was a view of Christology back in the 2nd century called Logos Christology, where the analogy would be that God spoke his word externally, and that's how Christ came to be. And the tradition rejected that eventually because that would strongly imply that Christ is caused by God in the worst sense of the term. It would make Christ a creature.
A created being. Yep.
But the Thomistic tradition said you can actually borrow from Logos Christology in one sense and speak of God speaking the word internally. And it's hard to imagine because my thoughts are not substantive. All of my thoughts are accidental to who I am. So any thought I have is simply just not a necessary feature of who and what I am.
Everyone else just heard that you don't think you're smart. Like I actually, I do know what you mean. What you mean is that your thoughts in and of themselves are not actual substance, but rather they're external to yourself.
Yeah, they're external to me. They're accidental to who and what I am. That doesn't mean that I'm not thinking them.
Yeah,
they're not accidents in that sense, but they're just not
that's
essential.
right.
So, like when this interview is over, I will be thinking of something else, and so nothing that I've said here is essential to who and what I am. I could be me and never have had this conversation. I could be me and never have had these thoughts, and you could be you, and the same thing can apply to you. For the creature, all of our thoughts are accidental to who we are, but imagine a being who is necessary, and the greatest thought that he has of himself is himself. As the author of Hebrews says, God can swear by none greater than himself. Kind of like the ontological argument, people, Gonolo and others have said, well, the ontological argument is just so bad because, you can't just wish God into existence. Everything else I know, I have to go out and search for and discover. You can't just say, well, God is the greatest conceivable being, therefore God exists. That's just ridiculous. Well, wouldn't it be like God to be sort of the exception to that rule? God is the greatest conceivable being, and therefore the mere fact that God is possible means that God is necessary. Well, imagine kind of an ontological argument going on in God where the greatest thought that God has of himself is self, and it's so powerful that something is begotten in that intrinsic word that exists from eternity. And it's so powerful, it can't be anything other than God himself, because God's greatest thought is himself. And so we have this intrinsic word being spoken from eternity where God enunciates internally, eternally and internally, and necessarily and substantially a spoken word, and relates to that as father to son. And then the love and the highest thought of the mind is truth. And therefore, this spoken intrinsic word is truth with a capital T, because it just is God, and yet is also distinct from God. And the love between the two is so rich and powerful that the spirit of love that proceeds from them is the Holy Spirit. And so this is an eternal relationship between these three persons that never had a beginning, will never have an end, and they exist in complete harmony and fellowship with one another. The reason I adopt the filioque clause, which our Greek Orthodox friends will not, is simply because the reason the Son is distinguished from the Father is because he is begotten and the Father is unbegotten. If the Spirit only proceeded from the Father, then there would be no distinction between the way the Spirit relates to the Father and the way the Son does, in which case they would collapse into one relation between the Father. And so there would be two and not one. But the highest manifestation of goodness via the will is love. And the highest manifestation of goodness via the mind is truth. The Son is truth, and the Spirit is the spirit of love between the Father and the Son. And that's how the three are distinguished. The Father is unbegotten, the Son is begotten, and the Spirit proceeds from the two of them. And so I don't know, I've certainly not, solved the problem.
Yeah.
Because I'm articulating a mystery here. But what I think I've done is I've given you a rationale for how it is that this very same essence that subsists in the Father proceeds from him to the Son, and nothing is lost in the procession. The Son is pure act. As Calvin would say, the Son is autotheos. He is himself God. And there's nothing about the Father that is not true of the Son, except the fact that the Son is begotten and the Father is not. And that's why they're distinct.
So talking about the Son, though, does not the Son take on flesh? Is that not a distinction between the Son and the Father now?
Sure. So even So what I would say, just to kind of finish the thought, there is no essential distinction between the three, and therefore,
Yes.
is there a distinction between the essence of God and the person we call the Son? No, there's no distinction between the essence of the Son and the person.
Yes. There's no distinction in the essence. Yeah.
Right.
And that I feel like is much easier and much more agreed upon, even many classical theologians, right? Because they would often say, even yes, even some of the social Trinitarians, they would view it as one essence, right? With
Sure.
Now some of them might use three selves or three minds. I don't know. Depends on which, I guess, term you wanted to choose for such a social Trinitarian view. But yeah.
But when it comes to the incarnation, there is a real distinction between the human nature and the Son, precisely because the human creature can admit of distinctions. And so there a distinction between the person we call the Son and his human nature? Well, yes. Because the creature can admit of distinctions. So there's no distinction between the Son and his divine nature, but there is a distinction between the Son and his human nature, and this is the simplicity is beautiful here because it accentuates the genuine distinction that subsists in the hypostatic union, so that the natures never commingle with one another. So simplicity comes along and saves the hypostatic union in a lot of ways, because I'm just repeating myself, but you can't have these natures commingling precisely because the creaturely nature admits of distinctions and the divine nature admits of none.
So let's talk about pure actuality. So pure actuality is one of the major tenets of divine simplicity, and it's also one of the greatest motivators, right? It's the idea that God is pure actuality. In other words, God has no potential or latency about him, right? In other words, he's not like contingent, like we were talking about contingencies earlier. So instead it's the idea that God is pure act. Part of the notion is that nothing can influence or change God, or that no changes can occur inside of God.
To put it another way, and I think you're right, just to give different language.
Sure.
God is pure actuality with no passive potency. God has active potency because God is all powerful, but God has no passive potency. So God receives absolutely nothing from anything outside of himself.
Okay, so my struggle with this portion of it, right, is going to be something like the act of creation. I guess do you just hold to a type of logical fatalism that all of creation exists necessarily?
Very good. So this is probably the best argument against my view of God. So this is
Okay.
I mean, I'm not, and this is a.
And I know, don't worry, you're not the simplicity apologist, but
yeah. Well, I mean, and I'm not trying to be rude when I say what I'm about to say. I'm just saying the Trinitarian objection to simplicity doesn't faze me. And that's just a matter of personal, that's my autobiography. So it doesn't prove or disprove anything. But I feel the pinch of the modal collapse argument. And so that's kind of what you just gave.
Yeah.
The idea is that if God is pure actuality, and if God is absolutely simple, then there is no distinction between any of God's attributes, which would include his will.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's no distinction between God's will and God, then there's no difference between God and God's active will. And since God does create and God is necessary, that would make creation necessary. And so we call it modal collapse because there are two modalities that we play with as philosophers. There's the modality called necessity. It's something which has to be or must be. And then the modality of contingency, that which can not be, that which is limited and changing and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And we call it modal collapse because the necessity of God collapses into creation, and therefore there's only one modality, necessity.
Yeah, and kind of like what we were talking about earlier, right? Contingencies are like, oh, what if this happened? Or it could have been this way or that way. And it's the idea that it's like, well, if God is necessary, his will is absolute, and he's perfectly simple, and he has no potentiality. In other words, there's no other possible way things could have been, because if things could have been different, that means God would have been different. And so his will itself is just what it is, then there are no possible worlds, right? Everything just kind of crunches into God's being, and what God's will is absolute, and therefore
Yeah, I mean,
everything
the
just
only
is.
options at that point would be atheism, which says that everything is contingent, or
Yeah.
pantheism, which says that everything is necessary. Theism is destroyed by the modal collapse argument, is the strongest way to put it. Chris Tomaszewski is a Catholic philosopher. He just got his PhD, and he has done a lot of great work in this. And so I would direct people that want more meat on this than I'm going to give right here. That's who I would highlight. Obviously, Ed Fazer and Dolitz have dealt with the modal collapse argument as well. My 50-cent version of this would be, even though there's no distinction between God and his will, there is a distinction to be made between the will and the effects of the will. And if you want sort of a very easy analogy, we speak of Cambridge changes that go on between two persons. So, for example, let's say that a father has a son. Obviously, as a baby, the son is much smaller than the father. But what if the baby grows up to be a man that's taller than his father? There's a change in relationship between the father and the son, to wit, the father was taller than the son and became shorter. But who changed really in the relationship? Well, it would be the son that was going through all the changes, and the father only took on a kind of relational property vis-a-vis the son. But it's a property taller than, shorter than, that really inheres in the son. Well, you can speak of God and creation in a similar way, where God is absolutely immutable in and of himself, but in willing a contingent universe to obtain, that universe can change and be different than it is and so forth, without any real changes going on in God. And so the metaphysical distinction between God and creation is maintained simply by saying that even though there's no distinction between God and his will, there is a distinction between that will and the effects of the will.
So this is going to go in a slightly different direction, but I find it very much to be related. But then doesn't that commit you to a timeless universe, or a B theory of time, where the universe is actually set on a block theory of time?
I'm not 100% sure if it commits me to that. I know Craig wrote a really good essay back in the 80s for the Thomist Journal, and the title of it is, "Was Thomas Aquinas a B theorist?"
Okay.
And
That's an interesting one. Yep.
yeah, it's a really good essay. I don't know if I agree with it, simply because Thomas has some really curious statements in the Summa where he'll say things like, God did not become Lord until he created. So
Okay.
now
Yep.
you may argue that that's an inconsistency on Thomas's part, but as far as historical exposition is concerned, I'm not convinced that Thomas would be holden to a B theory necessarily. I'm not sure why there can't be real changes going on outside of him while he remains absolutely mutable. In fact, Craig himself gave an analogy in one of his talks where he speaks of the rock. This is a thought experiment, frozen at absolute zero, and therefore it does not change intrinsically at all. But all the things going around it are really changing with respect to the rock, and even intrinsically with respect to themselves. So I'm very much moved by the A theory of time. I want to believe that the conscious changes going on in me is saying something about reality, so that time is really changing, and that what exists right now is the present. But I'm not sure why God couldn't be absolutely immutable intrinsically, but change extrinsically in the way I was just describing with the Cambridge changes.
Well, because I mean, to me, the reason why I'm expressing it that way exactly is because if God is pure actuality, then from all eternity or whatever, right? That there isn't a moment in God, so to speak, right? There isn't a moment in God in which he decides to create. So therefore the universe must
Right.
therefore be eternal.
I don't know if that's true, because even on Craig's model, he's going to have to say something very similar. I mean, before time begins, God from eternity has to will that a temporally finite universe be. Now, once it comes to be, God is
Yes.
drawn into time. And so with creation, he's temporal. Now, I think that creates problems on its own. For example, the first antinomy of Kant, where Immanuel Kant will basically say, you can ask the question, when did God become temporal? Well, that's a meaningful question given the fact that he became temporal.
It would be upon the first
But
moment or act of creation, right?
Yeah, but if he's willing from eternity to do this,
no, he's willing from that moment.
So God is not atemporal before creation.
Yeah, he would, right? So, but like if you're, and this, I hate how so Craig always uses this term like sans creation,
Sure.
And I totally understand why he does, because that's the very difficulty in and of itself, right? Of, okay, if we are talking about things, we always speak only in temporal language because we live in this world, right? So he would say sans creation, and then, of course, at that moment, it is the simultaneous act that basically enters him into time or creation, right? So then,
Well, I mean, it just seems to me that if God is atemporal without creation, then there was never a time when he began to will to create. He willed from eternity to create. And so it seems to me, I mean, Tomaszewski has made this point that the problems that are supposedly encumbering simplicity for the classical theists, that many of those same problems, if not all of them, encumber the neoclassical theist, because both of us hold to a doctrine of necessity. We believe that God is a necessary being. The question is,
and eternity.
Right. So the question is, how does a necessary being relate to a contingent effect? That's really what we're talking about. And it seems the same problems that I have on that specific issue would be similar problems that you have. If God is atemporal before he creates, whatever that means, then that means that from eternity, he never began to will to create. So why can't you just say, to solve the problem for both of us, you could just say, from eternity, God simply willed that a temporally finite universe obtain.
So the reason why I would be very hesitant to say that is because the universe seems to have began at some point, right?
Right. So since God from eternity willed that a temporally finite universe obtain, the temporal effect has an absolute beginning at creation. But God willed that temporally finite effect obtain from eternity. And so God wills, he gives Thomas gives the analogy of, the doctor gives a prescription to the patient. That description is what we might call the decree. This is your medicine. This is your prescription that you're going to take. But does the whole prescription take place in the moment in which it's handed to the patient? No. The prescription obtains over time, where you take the pill, say, once a day for many days. Well, God gives an eternal decree that a temporally finite universe be, but the events themselves fall out successively in time. This is why I'm not convinced. If I were convinced that Thomism entailed B theory, I would bite the bullet and move on with my life. But I'm not convinced right now, at least.
Well, you wouldn't really move on. You would still be stuck in that. No.
Oh, right, yeah.
Type joke.
No, but I mean, I would have to just handle that. And, Craig, it may affect, say, my adherence to the Kalam argument, although in these later years, earlier Craig said that the Kalam argument is tied to an A theory of time. But he has recently, over the past couple of years, has said, I guess it could be reconciled to the B theory. And he says all the better. In other words, the argument is stronger if it's not beholden to a specific view of time.
Sure.
So, but having said all of that, I'm just not convinced that I am beholden to either an A or B theory, if in fact I maintain my Thomism.
Yeah. What is your biggest objection towards Molinism? What is it? And it could just even be a personal one. Like, doesn't have to be like, what's the strongest objection? But let's just talk a little bit about, some of your objections.
Well, okay. Thank you again. For those that are interested, I think you read my paper on
I
Molinism that
did. And it's a good paper. It's a very good paper.
thank you. It was published in 2006.
Just
Lou Van Horen offered some objections to the paper, which I felt the pinch of. And I said, I need to change some things. Probably the author that did a lot more to change my mind on my older stance on Molinism more than anybody was Kurt McGregor.
okay.
And I think that I know that your audience loves Molina, or they're at least very interested in.
No, I doubt most of them actually.
If you're a fan of William Lane Craig, it's hard to listen to him long before you're hearing expositions on Molinism and middle knowledge. And so I get why your audience would be intrigued by it, even if they're not, fully embracing it. But I think one of the best reads on Molinism that you can get after you read maybe Craig's popular book, I think
The
it's
Only Wise God. Yeah.
Very good book. And there's some others out there, and he has some essays that are really good. But once you get your feet wet a little bit, I think Kurt McGregor's biography on Molina is an incredibly important read for those that want to get into this material. And my mind changed on Molina. So like before I read McGregor's book, I would have told you that Molina was not a Christian because he compromised the doctrine of sola gratia. Okay. Now, what I'm getting at is I am of the opinion that there are certain essentials that you absolutely have to believe as a Christian. And there may be some others that you don't necessarily have to believe, but if you reject them, that just kind of proves that you aren't. For example, if you believe in Jesus, you don't have to know the ins and outs of everything to be saved. But if later you say, I'm not saved by grace alone, I'm saved by grace and my good works, I would just be very upfront with you and say, well, you can't be a Christian if you deny sola gratia. And Molina, the way I was reading him, and I was getting this from Craig, Molina said, or at least I was thinking he was saying, that we're not saved by grace alone. And there's a curious line in one of Craig's scholarly books where he says, if you want to be a Christian, you have to be either a Protestant or a Thomist, which I think is one of the great, is a very interesting statement on this part. So I was very comfortable going around saying that until I read McGregor's book. And McGregor said, proved to my satisfaction that I was wrong. And I love it. I love the fact that Molina wanted to preserve sola gratia. He couldn't fully embrace the reformational view of justification. But so I'm not willing to necessarily say, well, you're not a Christian, just because you don't agree with me on all these other things. You want to believe that you're saved by God's grace alone. So when I wrote The Wonderful Decree, I actually offered some, criticisms of my earlier article. And so just to interest the readers, I have sections in my book where I revisit some of those issues and make the corrections. But bottom line is, in my view, Molina's doctrine of middle knowledge cannot be reconciled with simplicity, nor can it be consistently reconciled to a biblical notion of aseity.
Yeah, so it's exactly it's these notions about the nature of God, the very nature of God. And basically, well, like the title of it, right? The divine decree, God's decree for that which will happen, right? And you just find this, to be inconsistent. And I'll just say, I completely understand. I understand why. Of course, I disagree as to some of how the inner workings go, but I understand why. And I'll say this, right? I really got to, when I was studying soteriology, I really got to understand and appreciate so much more the Calvinist and the open theist, because I felt like really the Calvinist and the open theist, they actually agree on much more. The difference is just where they divide. You know what I mean? They agree that hey, look, this has got to be essential. The open theist basically just says, the case is though that God simply doesn't have that kind of sovereignty and therefore libertarian free will. Right. And the Calvinist is saying no, God does have sovereignty to the maximal degree and therefore not open theism or hard forms of libertarian free will. Right. And so I felt it's oh, you know what? Now I understand open theism, why why they believe that. And then, of course, Molinism's a completely different arena. And so they're kind of trying to placate to those. And Molinists, we get beat up by everybody because the Arminians are like, you guys are Calvinists. And the Calvinists are like, no, you're Arminians.
Sure.
So,
well, it's not absolutely necessary to reject Calvinism, even if open theism were true, because you could say that the unconditional election on God's part is a temporal election that God does in time, in the present moment. So technically, you could be a Calvinist who is an open theist. I don't recommend it. I think it's wrong.
I don't think there is one on earth.
I have heard of such persons.
Really? I would be shocked.
I have not read them, but I have on pretty good authority that such persons exist. I just haven't, I did do my dissertation on open theism, and I heard about those individuals, in the years following me writing that, and I had moved on to other things and I just didn't pursue it. But so I have heard of such individuals, but I do say in my dissertation even that technically, logically speaking, you could reconcile these things together. It's just that I think I have other biblical reasons for rejecting open theism.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. I've met a few different open theists these days, and yeah, they're pretty interesting. I understand Peter Van Enwagen is an open theist, as far as I recall. Which, to be honest, I guess I wasn't super surprised. Like, he's pretty. I don't know. He's like, they're very rigid, and so they leave much less room for mystery. Like, I guess I would say that to me, most open theists, they just don't want any mystery. It's like very all or nothing, I guess. I don't know. That's my experience.
Now, my experience has been that, but just to add, when you press them, they do have mystery. It's just located in the creature and not God.
That's yeah, actually, dude, man, I'm clip that right there. Let's go ahead and let's start wrapping up here. Travis, thanks so much. It's been great. Do you have any other resources or places that people can find you?
I'm working on a website. I'm a full-time teacher, so it's hard to do it right, and I don't want to do it at all if I can't do it right. I have a domain. I just haven't really put the content in there yet. But in the meantime, I do have a YouTube channel that I work on. I contribute to when I can. Now that certain duties of mine in my career are over, I'm going to get back to it. I'm doing a series on the historical Jesus, and I'm starting with whether Jesus existed, and I'm critiquing Christ's mythicists. So I'm spending time on that.
Yeah, dude, let me tell you, that'll be worthwhile because I just feel like there's a massive resurgence of everyone pointing to Christ as a myth or legend. And yeah.
I can give you sort of links in the description.
Yep.
I'll send you the emails to those, but I consider this, my organization, as a fledgling one. I have a staff of one and a handful of contributors. So, we're doing what we can. I'm just working in my church and working at school and just spending time with my family. So I'm just, this is a wonderful opportunity that I have to speak with people like you and others on these topics. And it's a lot of fun, and I think I grow through it. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Yeah. If you guys want to see more about Travis or hear more about any of those articles and everything, I'll be sure to have a bunch of his links below in the description. And who knows, we'll have to get you back for some further conversation, but we got through a decent portion, but there's plenty left to talk about. So thank you guys so much. Travis, God bless you, and we'll talk to you soon.
Take care.